This video is now in session, and 2 videos ago, I talked about the population decline that the United States will inevitably face because of the low fertility rates. But in this video, let's talk about where those populations are actually going, where the 331 million Americans are moving to, because America is always a country where people are constantly moving from one state to another, from one place to another place. And here we can see the population shifts. This is from a video that I did, I believe, like several weeks ago, maybe, talking about which states and which places are decreasing in population and which places are increasing in population. And generally speaking, the places that are increasing in population are exurban areas, and as well as these kinds of rural areas used to be rural areas. Idaho, Utah, Arizona, Texas all used to be kind of rural areas. Now they're getting more urbanized. And this is a trend that we're going to continue to see again and again and again, because right now we're in a pandemic. We're still in a pandemic, and people are wanting to move out of these urban established cores where renting and housing might be priced way too high, and from there moving to a different place in a state, or moving to a completely different state in general. And that is in terms of politically speaking, that's good for Democrats. And the reason why is that the people that are moving out of their state, they're mostly Democrats. If we're looking at where people are moving out of, it's California, it's New York, it's Illinois, mainly Chicago, it's Pennsylvania and the Philadelphia area. I didn't list Philadelphia here, but it's mainly out of Philadelphia. Michigan, it's mainly out of the Detroit area and the suburbs. And they're all moving to more rural places, and they're moving to the southern United States. And that's good for Democrats because these two places are Republican places. And when you have Democrats moving over to Republican areas, they usually take their politics with them. So as a result, a Republican state over time gets more and more Democratic. Now, there is obviously one exception to this, and Florida's always the exception to everything. But here we see a lot of movement from rural Rust Belt counties over to Floridian counties. And that's why we see Florida trending more towards Republican. But overall, though, Democrats are being affected in a positive way by all of these population shifts. And with the pandemic, it's causing people in the Democratic areas to leave the city and to move over to more exurban areas. And here you can see one exurban area in Lathrop, California, and and all of these little places are booming with more and more housing, and it's because of these people moving from the urban areas, which then means that Democrats are then spread out, and that's very beneficial for Democrats. Politically speaking, very beneficial, because not only does it make states more Democratic, like Republican states like Utah more Democratic, it also ensures that gerrymandering gets harder and harder, because generally speaking, gerrymandering is easiest when a certain group of voters is packed in a certain area. So for Democrats, they're packed in urban cores. You mainly see Democrats in urban areas. So it's very easy for Republicans to then crack all of these urban areas so that they get different districts. But in comparison, it's very hard to crack Republican districts. It's very hard to crack Republican places because they're all spread out. Generally speaking, they're all spread out in rural areas, which means that if you want to crack a rural area, you might have to combine that with another rural area in order to get the right amount of population for a congressional district. And that is what makes gerrymandering Democrats so easy and gerrymandering Republicans less easy. But with Democrats moving out to these different states and moving to even suburban areas, it makes it harder for It makes it harder for Republicans to gerrymander Democrats. Now, it's still going to be easier to gerrymander in the 2020 redistricting cycle, since these population shifts are more long-term rather than just short-term within these 2 years, especially with the census being taking place in early to late 2020 and not in 2021. So the congressional apportionment might have changed now with a lot of people move into different places, but we can see here that the fastest growing places are Utah, Idaho, Texas, North Dakota, and Nevada. Slowest growing are Connecticut, Michigan, Ohio, Wyoming, and Pennsylvania. For Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Ohio, these are all Rust Belt states that have Democrats and Republicans moving out of them. So it's mainly Democrats. Some Republicans are moving out to Florida, but mostly Democrats moving out to either southern United States, mostly Black Americans from the Rust Belt area moving over to the southern United States, bringing their politics back to their historical limelight, and then also to these more western states here, the Sun Belt states, Texas, Arizona, Utah, Colorado, New Mexico. These are all states that Rust Belt populations are moving to. In terms of the fastest growing, we see here Utah, Idaho, Texas, North Dakota, and Nevada. For Utah is the fastest growing, and not surprisingly so, because a lot of tech companies are moving over, which then means a lot of millennials and a lot of younger people who generally vote Democratic also start to move over to Salt Lake City. And Idaho, same thing. Tech companies are moving over to Idaho. Texas, even more true than ever. Even more true than these two other states. There are a lot of companies moving over to Austin and Dallas, Texas, which creates new housing, and a lot of millennials are filling up those new housings, and that is contributing to a population increase in Texas and a shift from solid red Republican over to likely Republican, and soon it will be lean Republican, and eventually it will become lean Democratic. And you can see here North Dakota, Nevada. These are all places that Democrats are moving to because not because they strictly want to take politics with them, but rather because they want to spread out themselves. Democrats have been concentrated in cities for so long that they probably want something new, and that is a good sign for politics. Obviously, it would be a better sign if this happening in conjunction with Republicans moving from rural places to urban places, so that there's a mix of Republicans and Democrats both in urban and rural areas. But unfortunately, Republicans are still mostly going to stay in the rural areas. But the reason why it's good that Democrats are moving to the rural areas is because it creates some level of moderation. And moderation is what the United States was founded upon. And for states like Texas, for states like Utah, these are very polarizing places. These are very partisan places. And having Democrats move over to both of these places creates some level of moderation. Obviously, it's not completely evident right now, especially in Texas, when conservatives are bringing a lot of bills, a lot of very, very conservative bills to the state legislature of Texas. But once Democrats either take over the state legislature, whenever Democrats take over the state house or the state senate, which will inevitably be soon, it will be sooner than later, then moderation will have to be implemented, and that's a good thing. Moderation is not necessarily a bad thing, even though it might not create a ton of good progress. At the same time, it halts all the potentially bad progress that any party does. And it would obviously, again, be best if Republicans moved from their rural places. A lot of, like half of Republicans moved from their rural places over to states like California or New York to create some moderation there. But that's just not happening. So those are the population shifts that are happening in the United States. And we also have to talk not just about the United States, but also the United States territories. Territories like Puerto Rico, which had a large decrease from 2010, most probably because of the hurricanes that hit and ravaged Puerto Rico in the past few years. And as a result, there's been a population decline of around 3.4%. And a lot of those populations are moving over to Florida. They're moving over to the Sunbelt places and as well as the Northeast. And that presents an interesting thing to talk about because Puerto Rico is socially conservative, but they also do sometimes vote for Democrats, which means that this voting bloc, when they move, since more and more are moving over to the United States, they're more likely to kind of shake up the elections, especially if they're in swing states like Florida, North Carolina, Georgia, or even the Northeast in Pennsylvania, even though I don't really think Puerto Ricans are moving over to Pennsylvania. So those are some things to keep in note for, I guess, the long term. This population, I guess, movement has been accelerated by the pandemic, and the pandemic has essentially enabled Democrats in urban areas to move over to more rural areas and work from home. So that is something interesting to look out for when it comes to elections, presidential elections in 2028, 2032, and beyond. So that's the end of this video. Hope you enjoyed it. This video is now adjourned, and I'll see you in the next one.